level where it functioned very well. Then people got very rich, fat, and comfortable, and had a chance to sit back and look at itself. But it also invented one of the most terrible weapons at the same time. Okay, so then that cycle sort of went through. But in order to maintain that cycle of wealth, you had to go outside. You know, it could no longer be generated within the country. You had to go outside to look for cheap labor because the labor movement had become strong and the wages had gone up and so on. So I think it's very complicated. I don't think you could really say, why did we elect Reagan this time around? I mean, one could say that we were on another one of these crazy cycles. You know, you could also attribute it to Kennedy and the Democrats. I mean, there was this big baby boom coming along. If you look at the curve in the growth of the size of government from the Kennedy administration on, it goes like this, and then it goes like that. Right from the Kennedy administration, the size of the government goes almost straight line up. If it had continued to go up, we would have had more government than people. You know, if they, in 10 years at the rate of growth that it was going through. So there's another factor. What role did that play? I don't know. See, I think it's real complicated.
I think another factor that took place is, and I remember a very, very significant political event took place in 1968. It didn't get much, I think if people who write the history books now wouldn't see it as significant, but I do. In 1968, a guy named George Wallace, who actually today is still governor of Alabama, who at that period was an admitted racist. He won international recognition because he stood, as some of you may recall, at the door in the front of the University of Alabama when it was about to be integrated, and the president had sent down troops down there, and he was defying the federal government and so forth and so on. And he was admittedly a white supremacist. And in '68, he decided to run for president of the United States. And all the very politically sophisticated people said, well, this is a joke. I mean, you have this admitted racist, and certainly he'll probably get some votes among white Southerners, but once he gets out of the South, he's going to be laughed, he's going to be laughed out of the ballpark. So he goes marching into Michigan for a Democratic primary. He's running a Democratic primary. And I think he lost the primary, I don't remember. He got an enormous amount of votes. And this was a very astounding phenomenon. People saying, I don't understand this. Here you have an admitted white racist running in a northern state, which is a liberal state or a moderate state, getting a tremendous amount of votes. What is going on? You see, that takes us to where we are today. And it was very shocking. You remember that, Rick? And then the word was out that there were a lot of white people, for example, who were not all that happy about the changes that were taking place in the civil rights movement. That, in fact, America was a lot more racist than people had thought. And, in fact, somewhere around that time, came a study done by, after, I guess, during the period of when Martin Luther King was killed, around that period, there was a study done on racism in the United States, done by Otto Kerner, I remember, the Kerner Commission was called. And it really made the point that, in fact, racial feelings and racial hostility, racial prejudice, was a lot deeper than people had, the academics, if you like, had allowed themselves to believe. And I think what began to happen is, as this becomes apparent, then politicians, whether it's the Ronald Reagans or the Spiro Agnews, begin playing on that point, begin playing on the racism which was becoming quite apparent. So I guess one of the things, if you talk about the 60s, which I think is very important to understand the 80s, you understand the backlash. You know, we could talk about Janis Joplin and the Beatles and all these wonderful things, and 500,000 young people coming together in Woodstock and da-da-da, fine. You got to talk about that. But that's not all that was happening. George Wallace is suddenly getting votes running a campaign of racism in the United States. How do the two go together? How does that relate to what's happening in the United States today? Okay, an important issue. So again, things don't only look at the young people doing all these wonderful things. There were other things going on in the country at that time. And in fact, taking your question a step further, maybe we can open this up. How do you go from the 60s to where you are in the 80s? What's the process? What are the important events? Questions or comments?